The story everyone learns about money is that it replaced barter, and there is no good evidence any society ever worked that way. The version in economics textbooks runs like this. Before money, people traded goods directly, which was inefficient because it required a coincidence of wants. You needed to find someone who had what you wanted and wanted what you had. Money solved this by providing a universal medium of exchange, and civilization followed. It is a clean story. Anthropologists have been pointing out for over a century that no observed society has actually operated a barter economy of that kind as its primary system, and that the historical and ethnographic record instead shows something considerably more interesting. Credit came first and coins came remarkably late. Let's dig into this properly, because the barter question determines how the rest of the story reads. What anthropologists find in small-scale societies without money is not people haggling over exchange rates for chickens, it is systems of obligation. Goods and services move between people who know each other, on the understanding that the recipient owes something in return at some unspecified future point. The debt is remembered rather than settled immediately, and the relationship it creates is frequently the point rather than an inconvenience. Barter, in the textbook sense, does occur, and it occurs mostly between strangers, between communities with no ongoing relationship, or in situations where a money system has collapsed. Prison economies, wartime exchange, and hyperinflation all produce it. That is the reverse of the textbook sequence. Barter appears as a fallback when money fails rather than as its predecessor. The alternative account, argued by a number of anthropologists and economic historians, is that credit and debt are older than currency, that the earliest written records support this, and that money emerged partly as a way of quantifying obligations that already existed, rather than as a solution to the awkwardness of swapping goods. Let's talk about what the earliest records actually show too, because Mesopotamia provides the evidence. The oldest substantial body of writing anywhere consists of administrative tablets from temple and palace institutions, and they are overwhelmingly accounts, quantities of grain, allocations of rations, obligations owed, and debts recorded. Those records use units of value. Amounts are expressed in weights of silver and in measures of barley, and prices for various goods and services are stated in those terms. Crucially, the silver frequently did not move. A debt might be denominated in silver and settled in barley, labor, or goods, with the silver functioning as a unit of account rather than as a physical medium of exchange. That distinction matters enormously, and it recurs throughout monetary history. Money performs several separable functions: a unit for measuring value, a means of settling debts, a store of value, and a medium of exchange. And a society can have some of these without the others. Mesopotamia had sophisticated accounting in standardized units for well over 1,000 years before anyone made a coin. Interest-bearing loans appear in these records, along with legal codes setting maximum rates, provisions for debt slavery when loans could not be repaid, and periodic royal proclamations canceling certain categories of debt. That last practice is significant because it indicates debt accumulation was a recurring social problem serious enough to require intervention. This detail is worth sitting with directly, because it means writing and money developed together, and for the same reason. The earliest writing was accounting, the accounting recorded obligations, and the obligations were denominated in standard units. Money in the sense of a unit of account is roughly as old as writing, and both emerged from the administrative requirements of early states. Let's talk about the things used as money too, because the range is wider than most people expect, and the pattern in it is informative. Cowrie shells functioned as currency across an enormous area including parts of Africa, South Asia, and China, remaining in use in some regions into the modern era. Cattle served as a store of wealth and unit of value across many societies, and the word pecuniary derives from the Latin for cattle. Salt, cloth, beads, metal bars, and standardized quantities of grain all did comparable work in different places. The properties that make something usable are consistent. It has to be durable enough not to spoil, portable enough to move, divisible or at least available in standard units, difficult to counterfeit or obtain freely, and recognized by the people using it. Cowries score well on most of these, which is why they lasted so long over such a wide area, until European traders began importing them in bulk from Indian Ocean sources, at which point the supply constraint failed and the value collapsed, which is an early demonstration of what happens when money can be produced cheaply. There are also cases that stretch the definition usefully. The stone discs used on the island of Yap in Micronesia were large, in some cases enormous, and ownership transferred without the object moving. One famous stone reportedly sank during transport and continued to function as wealth despite lying on the seabed, because everyone agreed who owned it. That is money reduced to its essentials. A shared ledger held in collective memory, with the physical object almost incidental. Let's talk about banking too, because the institutions handling money are nearly as old as the units and they solved problems coinage created. Mesopotamian temples and palaces functioned as deposit institutions, holding grain and valuables, making loans, and recording obligations. That is banking in substance, if not in name, and it emerged from the same administrative apparatus that produced writing. The classical world developed money changing as a specialized trade, necessary because numerous cities issued their own coinage with different weights and standards, and anyone trading across regions needed conversion. The Greek term for the table such a person worked at is the root of several modern words for bank, and the Italian word for bench performs the same service. Medieval Europe faced a specific problem that produced a specific solution. Moving coin over distance was dangerous, and religious prohibitions on charging interest complicated lending. The Bill of Exchange addressed both. A merchant could deposit money in one city and receive a document redeemable in another, which moved value without moving metal. And because the transaction involved different currencies, the difference in exchange rates could absorb what was effectively interest without being described as such. Italian banking families built substantial operations on these instruments through the 13th to 15th centuries, developing double-entry bookkeeping alongside, which is a seriously important intellectual technology, recording every transaction twice as a debit and a credit so that errors reveal themselves through the accounts failing to balance. Deposit banking then produced the discovery that underpins modern finance. A bank holding deposits notices that depositors rarely withdraw everything at once and can therefore lend out a portion while remaining able to meet ordinary demands. That is enormously productive and structurally fragile, since it works only while confidence holds, and the history of banking is punctuated by the failures that occur when it does not. Let's talk about coins too, because they are much later than the general story implies. Standardized metal coinage, pieces of consistent weight and purity, stamped by an issuing authority to guarantee both, appears around the 7th century BCE in Lydia, in what is now Turkey, made from electrum, a naturally occurring gold and silver alloy. What coins added was the removal of assessment. Before them, transacting in metal required weighing it and evaluating its purity at every exchange, which required scales, expertise, and trust. A stamped coin transfers that verification to the issuer, and the stamp is essentially a claim that this piece contains what it says it does. That makes coinage a political technology as much as an economic one. The issuer gains authority and gains revenue, since coins can be issued at a face value slightly above the cost of the metal and production. It also creates a permanent temptation, because reducing the metal content while keeping the face value constant generates immediate income, and debasement appears in the numismatic record of essentially every long-lived coinage. Coinage spread rapidly through the Greek world and into Persia, and independently developed traditions appear in India and China around comparable periods, with Chinese coinage taking distinctive forms including pieces shaped like tools, and later round coins with square holes for stringing together. Let's talk about the places that managed without it too, because several large complex societies operated at scale with no coinage, and their arrangements are instructive. The Inca Empire administered a territory running thousands of kilometers along the Andes, supporting a substantial population with no currency whatsoever and no market system in the usual sense. Obligations were met in labor, with subjects owing work to the state on a rotating basis, and goods moved through a redistributive system in which the state collected produce into vast storehouses and distributed it according to need and administrative decision. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Records were kept on knotted cords, and the system supported roads, terracing, irrigation, and monumental construction across difficult terrain. Egyptian administration through much of its history operated similarly, with values expressed in standard units of weight and grain for accounting purposes while actual transactions moved goods and labor rather than money. Coinage arrived in Egypt late and largely through foreign influence. Various societies used specialized currencies restricted to particular purposes rather than general ones. Objects acceptable for bride wealth, for compensation payments, or for ritual obligations, but not exchangeable for food or ordinary goods. Anthropologists have documented systems with several parallel currencies operating in separate spheres, where converting between them was difficult or prohibited, which is a very different arrangement from money that buys anything. The pattern worth extracting is that general-purpose currency is one solution among several to the problem of coordinating an economy, and that large complex states have functioned without it. Its spread had as much to do with trade between strangers, with taxation, and with paying soldiers as with any internal efficiency, and the societies that adopted it earliest tended to be those doing a great deal of all three. Let's talk about what money does to social relations too, because the effects are substantial and were noticed early. The central property is that money makes obligations impersonal and transferable. A debt owed within a community, remembered rather than recorded, is embedded in a relationship. It carries expectations about future behavior, it can be renegotiated according to circumstance, and it cannot be sold to a stranger. A debt denominated in currency can be quantified precisely, transferred to someone the debtor has never met, and enforced without reference to any relationship at all. That transformation has clear benefits. It permits exchange between strangers at scale, which is a prerequisite for any economy larger than a village. It allows value to be stored and moved. And it makes complex coordination possible without anyone needing to know or trust anyone else personally. It also produces effects that societies have found troubling enough to legislate against repeatedly. Debt denominated in money accumulates through interest regardless of the debtor's circumstances, and the consequences of default are severe and impersonal. Debt bondage and debt slavery appear across a wide range of societies, and the Mesopotamian practice of periodic debt cancellation, along with comparable provisions in various religious and legal traditions, including jubilee provisions and prohibitions on usury, represent attempts to manage a problem the technology creates. Philosophers and religious thinkers across many traditions have expressed unease about money specifically, generally centering on the idea that it makes commensurable things that should not be, that assigning a price to labor, land, obligation, or life itself changes their character. Those arguments are considerably older than industrial capitalism and appear independently in Greek, Chinese, Indian, and Abrahamic thought. Let's talk about paper too, because it required a different kind of trust and China got there first. Chinese merchants developed deposit receipts during the Tang period, and the Song dynasty issued what is generally regarded as the first government paper money, driven partly by the sheer inconvenience of transporting large quantities of bronze coin. Paper money is a fundamentally different proposition. A gold coin has value that is at least partly independent of its issuer. A piece of paper has value only because people believe it does, which makes the arrangement dependent entirely on confidence in whoever issued it. Chinese authorities discovered the consequences repeatedly, with several episodes of overissue producing severe inflation and eventual abandonment of the paper currency. Europe came to it later, developing through goldsmiths' receipts and bills of exchange into banknotes, and the pattern of overissue and collapse recurred in various national experiments. The gradual formalization of central banking through the 17th to 19th centuries was substantially an attempt to manage exactly this problem. Let's talk about what happens when money fails too, because the failure modes are consistent across periods and they clarify what money actually is. Debasement is the oldest. Reducing the metal content of coins while maintaining face value generates immediate revenue for the issuer and produces predictable consequences. Prices rise as people recognize the coins are worth less. The older, heavier coins disappear from circulation as people hoard or melt them, and confidence in the currency degrades. The observation that bad money drives out good has been stated in various forms since antiquity and is usually attributed to a 16th century English financier, though earlier writers had noted it. The Spanish experience following the influx of American silver provides a large-scale demonstration of a different mechanism. Enormous quantities of silver arriving from mines in the Americas increased the money supply substantially across Europe, and prices rose over the following period in what historians describe as a sustained inflation. The specific weight of silver in that story is debated, with population growth and other factors also contributing, and the general lesson that more money chasing the same goods raises prices has held up. Hyperinflations are the extreme case, and several are well documented. Interwar Germany is the famous example, with prices rising at rates that made currency worthless within days and produced the familiar images of banknotes used as fuel and wages collected twice daily. Comparable episodes have occurred in numerous countries since, and the pattern is consistent. A government unable to raise sufficient revenue resorts to issuing currency. Confidence collapses, and the collapse accelerates as people spend immediately rather than hold money that is losing value hourly. What these episodes reveal is that money is a shared belief with institutional backing, and that the belief can fail. When it does, people revert to foreign currency, to commodities, or to barter. Which is where the textbook sequence gets its intuition from, and it is describing a breakdown rather than an origin. Let's talk about the modern situation too, because the trajectory has run consistently in one direction. The link between currency and metal, maintained through various gold standard arrangements, was progressively abandoned across the 20th century, ending with the closure of dollar convertibility in the early 1970s. Every major currency is now fiat, valuable because a government declares it legal tender, and because everyone accepts it, with no commodity backing. Meanwhile, the physical form has been receding. The overwhelming majority of money in modern economies exists as entries in banking systems rather than as notes or coins, and most of it is created by commercial banks in the act of lending rather than printed by governments, which is a point that surprises people and is uncontroversial among economists. Digital payment has accelerated this, and several countries have moved substantially toward cashless transaction, while others have resisted, with arguments concerning privacy, financial inclusion, resilience during outages, and the position of people without bank accounts. Central banks in numerous countries are actively developing digital currencies, and cryptocurrencies have prompted extensive debate about whether decentralized systems can perform monetary functions on which serious people disagree substantially. Let's talk about armies and taxes too, because they supply the most persuasive account of why coinage spread when and where it did. The problem a state faces with a standing army is provisioning. Soldiers must be fed and paid, they move around, and they cannot be supplied through the local obligation networks that support a settled population. Handing them coins solves it neatly, provided the coins are accepted by the people the soldiers buy food from. The mechanism ensuring acceptance is taxation. If a ruler mints coins, pays soldiers with them, and then demands that everyone pay taxes in those same coins, the population must obtain them, which means selling goods and services to whoever has them. The state has created demand for its own currency by requiring it for a payment nobody can avoid, and in doing so has converted a scattered agricultural economy into one that produces marketable surplus and accepts state money. That account, like sometimes described as the state theory of money, explains several things the barter story does not. It explains why coinage appears in regions with mercenary armies and expanding states. It explains why the earliest coins were frequently in denominations too large for everyday purchases, since they were designed for paying soldiers rather than buying bread. And it explains why states have consistently insisted on monopoly over issuance and treated counterfeiting as among the most serious crimes, frequently punishable by death. It also connects to the modern situation directly. fiat currency has value substantially because tax obligations must be settled in it, which creates unavoidable demand regardless of whether anything backs it. The mechanism identified in ancient coinage is the same one operating now. The account is not universally accepted, and economists disagree about how much weight it carries relative to accounts emphasizing market convenience. What is not disputed is that states and coinage have been entangled from the beginning. It is worth noting how these objects are secured, because the problem shapes their physical design. Coins were originally protected by weight and purity alone, which invited clipping, shaving metal from the edges, and accumulating the shavings. Milling the ridged edge still present on many coins was the 17th century answer, making any interference immediately visible. It persists today on coins whose metal is worth less than their face value, largely because the ridges also help people identify denominations by touch. Banknotes required a different approach entirely, since the value lies in the paper's authenticity rather than its substance, and the techniques accumulated steadily. Distinctive paper with embedded fibers, watermarks formed during manufacture, raised intaglio ink, security threads, microprinting, color-shifting inks, and holograms. Accessibility became a parallel consideration, with denominations differing in size, carrying tactile markings, and using colors that remain distinguishable for people with common forms of color blindness. Let's talk about who is on the money too, because the choice is never incidental, and it makes currency one of the most widely distributed pieces of political communication a state produces. Early coinage carried images of rulers, and the practice served a specific function in societies where most people would never see the person governing them. A coin bearing a portrait circulates into every household and market, which makes it an unusually effective medium for establishing that someone is in charge. Roman emperors used coinage this way deliberately, and changes in portraiture track political events closely enough that numismatic evidence is used to date and interpret reigns. The pattern continues. Currency carries monarchs, presidents, founders, and national symbols, and revolutions and regime changes are followed reliably by new issues. Decolonization produced waves of new currencies replacing imperial designs with local figures and imagery, and the choices made in those redesigns were substantive arguments about national identity conducted in a medium everyone handles daily. Contemporary disputes follow the same logic. Campaigns to place women, minority figures, or particular historical figures on banknotes recur in numerous countries and generate real argument, precisely because the currency is understood as a statement about who a nation considers foundational. Decisions to remove figures whose historical record has been reassessed produce equally strong reactions in the other direction. Even the apparently neutral choices carry meaning. Currencies featuring scientists, writers, and artists rather than rulers are making a claim, and the shift toward abstract designs and architectural motifs on some multinational currencies was itself a decision to avoid national figures that no participating country could agree on. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. Money did not replace barter because there is no evidence of a society running on barter to replace. What the record shows instead is systems of credit and obligation, recorded in the earliest writing we have, denominated in standard units of grain and silver, with debt, interest, and periodic debt cancellation all appearing in Mesopotamian records more than 1,000 years before coins existed. Physical currency took many forms: cowries, cattle, salt, cloth, metal bars, and stone discs, selected for durability, portability, divisibility, and scarcity, and failing when any of those conditions broke. Standardized coinage appears around the 7th century BCE in Lydia, adding guaranteed weight and purity, and creating both a convenience and a political instrument. Paper money required trust in an issuer rather than in a metal, appeared first in China, and produced repeated inflationary failures that shaped the development of central banking, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. The oldest money was never a coin or a shell, but a shared memory of who owed what. And after 5,000 years of physical currency, the money almost everyone now uses has returned to being exactly that, a ledger entry with nothing behind it but agreement.